This episode is proudly brought to you by G Recovery, the Central Coast's leading destination for health, wellness, and performance recovery. From infrared saunas and compression therapy to ice baths and soft tissue treatments, they've got all the science-backed tools to help you feel and perform at your very best. Head to grecovery.com.au to book your next session or learn more. That's grecovery.com.au. So how are you? Thanks for coming on.
Great. Thanks for having me on, by the way, Eddie. It was a bit of a surprise, and I've got to admit, a little flattered that someone wanted to know about the vestibular system.
Yeah.
It's quite often ignored, and there aren't that many researchers, basic science researchers like myself, looking at how the system works.
So give us a little bit of your background. Where are you from and kind of how did you get into the vestibular system?
Sure. I guess my interest in the balance system was piqued during a Bachelor of Science degree at the University of New South Wales. And there was someone who was doing some research on back muscles or neck muscles at the time. And it just seemed like this person might be a reasonable, how shall I put it, mentor or supervisor if I wanted to look at this balance system, because I was intrigued. Every time I asked somebody about it, they didn't know too much, and it's a bit complicated. You might want to think about something else. And at the time, vision was a big area in sensory neurobiology, and the balance system was almost totally ignored. So I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. I want to find out about things that people don't know.
Yeah. So we kind of want to dive into that a bit more today, but give us a bit of a overview on the kind of sensory system and how it works.
Yeah, sure. Okay, where to start? It's one of those, well, let me begin by saying it's one of the oldest sensory systems that we have in our body. And you might think, oh, isn't vision or hearing really important, and wouldn't they be the first to occur? But if you think about it, we've always needed to know what was up and what was down. And regardless of whether we had vision or hearing, we had to know where we were oriented in space or in the environment. So balance, or at least knowing our spatial awareness, has been a sort of a sense that we've needed to know about since time immemorial. And yet, I have to say, it's one of the last sensory systems that we've sort of discovered and started to study. And that's mainly because it's such a subtle system. We don't really think about it until it goes wrong. And it's actually quite hard to study because it's the organs are not on the surface of our skin, or not on, sort of our ears. We can see where sound has to come in. The balance organs are deep within the skull, and that makes it tricky to study.
Yeah, we're going to jump into your, you did a inner ear study with mice. We'll jump into that a bit later.
Sure.
So there's a few effects that we kind of talk about in psychology in relation to sensory systems and stuff. Could you explain the cocktail party effect?
Oh, yeah. That has less to do with the balance system, but it's still the inner ear. And so the cocktail effect is sort of, I'm sure most of your listeners and viewers have seen that when you're in a party or in a pub, the background noise is pretty loud, right? In other words, that's an important noise contribution. And yet, for certain reasons, you can actually pick out the sound that you want out of all that hubbub, mostly because it's the person standing in front of you. And it's not because they have to raise their voice too loud. They may have to raise it just a little bit. But that cocktail party is referring to the fact that you can hear somebody despite all the background information that's coming to you. And what you're able to do is selectively pull out the frequencies and the sounds that you want to hear. It's quite a remarkable system. And that's it sort of leads into some of my research. It has to do with the feedback system from the auditory system. In other words, we normally think of sensory information traveling from the periphery out, wherever it is, back to the brain. But there's a whole pathway in sound and in balance that comes from the brain out to the organs, hearing organs or the balance organs. And it's that feedback system that sort of fine-tunes our ability to hear things. It's not like a simple volume control, because with a volume control, everything gets sort of amplified. What happens with our selective feedback is that it picks out the things that you want. And I'd argue that it does it the same way also in the balance system, but we can talk about that later on.
Yeah, so I think like when we talk about early stages of cognitive psychology, we kind of used to have this idea that the brain was very segmented into different parts that had kind of sole responsibilities. And I think it's common now that we see with more and more research coming out that it's all interconnected and everything is kind of firing and working alongside each other.
Absolutely, yeah. I've heard in the past people say, "Oh, we only use 10% of our brains," which is absolute rubbish. We use all of our brains all the time. Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about balance. What exactly is the vestibular system, and why haven't most people heard about it?
Well, it's a good question. I would argue the reason we don't think or hear about it too often, again, until it goes wrong, is it works exquisitely well. In other words, it works in the background, and maybe I'm attracted to the system because of that. It sort of works without fanfare, in other words, it's not like vision, which tells you all about the world, or hearing, where you can hear beautiful music. The vestibular system just gets on with its work. It sort of keeps everything sort of stable, but it also does it without fuss. It's sort of working just every moment of the day. Possibly goes a little bit to sleep as we do sleep, but I'd also argue that it's still working then, because if there's a sudden shift in the bed or the place that you're resting, it wakes you up, right? In other words, the balance system sort of is an alarm telling you, hey, this isn't normal. You ought to attend to it. So, that's one thing, but that's a balance system doing its work in the background. That's why I'm attracted to it. It really consists of the inner ear. There are two parts to it. There's a hearing part and a balance part. And remarkably, the two never mix, right? Unless you've got some sort of pathological conditions. In other words, loud noises don't disturb your balance, and shaking your head doesn't disturb your hearing. So even though they're sort of locked together in the inner ear, they have mostly nothing to do with each other. But it means that they're protected, and they're actually in the hardest part of the skull. It's called the petrous part of the temporal bone, and petrous means rock-like. Petrified wood is rock wood, right? And so it's in the deepest part of the skull, the thickest part of the skull, I'd say, and it is there for your protection, because if you have damage to the balance system, you begin to have serious trouble completing just everyday tasks.
So is it the same for all mammals?
It is. As I said, it's an ancient system, and virtually all animals that you can point to, from reptiles, birds, and mammals, even amphibians, which are frogs, and fish, have the same basic setup. They have three things called semicircular canals, and they detect rotational movements, and then usually have two flat receptor areas called the utricle and saccule. And every animal, virtually, with the exception of some very primitive fish, which have a similar system but perhaps only have two canals. But it's remarkably conserved right throughout the animal kingdom. And so what's great about, as researchers, what's great for us is that we can study this system in almost any kind of animal, and it sheds light on how the system works in all animals.
Yeah, I feel like the research it's so broad as well because there's so many things we don't understand about different kind of areas and things like that. We had an interesting question that someone wanted to ask you today.
Sure.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer it, but it was, how does being in space with no gravity affect the vestibular system?
That's a great question, and I do have colleagues. You see, the nice thing about the nice thing and the sad thing about the vestibular field is that there's only just a few of us, right? And so I'm not bragging here, but I know most of the people in the world that do studies on the balance system, right? And so I have colleagues who work at NASA, and they look at what they call microgravity changes in the balance system. And it's true that having sort of less gravity than we have on Earth has significant changes or appears to affect the balance system over time. So, for instance, if you think about the balance system as something that gets used to its environment, in other words, normally we're at 1G, sort of one at sea level would be at 1G, but up in space, as I said, it's a microgravity. And so our brain, our balance system has to adjust to that new, really frame of reference, because it's remarkable how the brain itself uses, well, let me just back up and say the brain has a voracious appetite for information, right? It will suck in information from wherever it can. Right? I almost think of the brain as being locked inside your skull. No windows, no way to get information except what it's being fed with, right? And balance system is just one of the things that feeds our brain. But the brain is using this all the time to adjust its sort of perception of the world and the area within its interest. And so the balance information in microgravity in space has to be adjusted, and there's no doubt that a lot of astronauts, I'd say probably close to 80 or 90% of astronauts, get something called space sickness. It's like car sickness or seasickness, and it takes them maybe up to 3 days to get used to that microgravity situation. And in that time, if they're a payload specialist, in other words, someone who has to do an important job, this is downtime they can sort of barely afford. So some of these people have to work while they're still feeling nauseous and ready to sort of throw up. And it's all because it takes time to adjust to this new environment.
The thought that comes to mind for me is orientation, and the example that comes to mind is when you're surfing or when you're diving and things like that. So you fall off a big enough wave and you don't really know which way is up.
Yes.
Talk to me about that. How is it difficult to kind of figure out where you are there?
Well, mainly because you're not tossed around very often, right? Admittedly, as a surfer, you probably get tossed around more than most. But I'd give you the example of an ice skater. You've seen these beautiful ballerina-like moves on ice, and then you see them spin, right? And they spin so fast that you and me, once we stopped spinning, we would be all over the place on the ice. But these people just manage to sort of glide off as though nothing has happened, and that has taken years of practice to overcome all the normal reactions we would have to, say, spinning. So again, I would say get tumbled around in the ocean often, and you'll begin to feel, oh, I know exactly where I am, and this way is up, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that it's like everything. You have to get used to even the extreme conditions to respond to it really well. My example again, or another example is I used to work with turtles. They're really great, fascinating animals. But when I'd come into the aquarium, these guys would jump off their logs. And we normally think of turtles as being slow animals, right? I mean, slow as a tortoise or slow as a turtle. These things, obviously, they were startled, so they jump off the log. And I kid you not, they did about 360s or 720 turns in the water, right? And then sped off. And it wasn't because they were disoriented. Absolutely not. It was part of their escape response. They knew exactly where they were, right? It was part of their escape system. They had it all figured out. And even though we think of them as being slow, in the water, it was just amazing, right? And that's that was the first time it dawned on me that, but wait a minute, they've got a system, of course, the same as ours. A lot of the time they're just sort of basking in the sun or crawling slowly to in and out of the water. But when they want to, they can really move.
There you go. I'm picturing Looney Tunes as you're saying that in the cartoons, and they're spinning on.
Yeah, well, it's that exactly. It's amazing.
Let's dive into a bit more of the science. So, talk to me about hair cells, and not the hair cells that we think.
Right. Yeah, it's not the hair cells on our heads or the hair follicles, as they're called. These are individual cells. They're sort of specialized. And they're just one cell tall, and they have these tufts of what we call stereocilia, or little projections from the top surface of the cell. And remarkably, what they do is when you bend that hair bundle, as they're called, in one direction, the cell will get excited. If you bend it in completely the opposite direction, they get inhibited. So, which means that whatever they're doing, they slow down. So what you have is really what we call a transducer, something that changes mechanical movement into electrical signals. So I could pick up my iPhone and show you that inside there somewhere are these transducers that are able to tell you where this phone is in space, right? And the same sort of thing we have in our inner ear. We have these little transducers, and they're sensing fluid motion, because every time we move our heads, we're moving fluid, and these things are detecting that motion and passing that signal on to the nerves that go back to the brain.
Are they directly related? So when you get like a in your ear infection and say you might have like fluid build up, is that what's affecting your balance then?
Not quite, no. So the fluid that, say, builds up in the ear is normally in the the middle ear, and I'm talking about the inner ear. So we have three parts to our ear: the outer ear, which we can see, the middle ear, which is where all these three little bones, actually called ossicles, they actually transmit sound, and it's actually where we get our infections. In other words, something called glue ear or otitis media is something that gets where you get an infection, because actually there's a tube that goes from your nasal passage up to that middle ear, and so it's a potential source of infection. And in kids, it happens a lot. So that's where the infections and the fluid gets. I'm talking about deep within the bone. These things are protected, as I mentioned before, and there's special fluid that is, again, remarkable. It's so different from any other fluids in your body, but it's the stuff that kind of sloshes around. I exaggerate, it sort of moves around. And that's what pushes on the hair cells. It's like if we think about a bicycle inner tube, and you don't fill it with air, you fill it with water. And that's exactly like one of these semicircular canals in the inner ear. So that when you move the inner tube when you move the inner tube, the fluid eventually moves, but it gets left behind initially. And that's exactly how our inner ear works.
So you mentioned before it's a kind of complex process with how much our brain kind of intakes all the information at once. How do we send feedback to the ear and vice versa?
It's it's a really, like all questions, it's a complicated question, but the best way I can sort of illustrate the feedback mechanism is this: that your your inner ear is telling your brain something about your head movements usually. But there's something that your brain wants to tell your balance organs, right? So it's two-way traffic. And what we think and what we've always thought about this feedback mechanism has to do with modulating things. And I don't mean quite like, as I mentioned, a volume control. That's a little too simplistic. The brain is too smart for just doing that. And that's unfortunately what hearing aids simply do. They just amplify the signal. But they've got better and better circuitry, which means that they can begin to pretend to do that sort of cocktail party effect that we're talking about. But in balance, that feedback is modulating the activity of the balance organs. So the question is, why is it modulating and how does it modulate it? And we've got some answers to that, but we're still sort of groping around in the dark to figure out exactly when this feedback is working.
So is that the role of efferent signals?
Yeah, exactly. It's there's something important that the brain wants to tell the balance organs and also the hearing organs. And also there's actually feedback to our vision as well, but not from the balance system, but from the brain. So a lot of sensory systems, when we've looked deeper, have a feedback mechanism. Somehow the brain wants to tell the organ something or adjust the organs in some way. And so that's exactly what that feedback or efferent system, because we use complicated words like afferents and efferents. Efferent just means signals that sort of like, if you think about effervescence, right? They're bubbles being given off. And so that's the way I remember it. So this is information given off by the brain as efferent information, but afferent is actually the other way around. In other words, it's coming from the external environment and it's going back to the brain. So that's, I think, often we overlook that sort of important feedback or efferent information. And it's been a mystery. It was sort of, at least in the balance system, it was discovered just after they discovered the balance feedback mechanism. And that's close to 70 years ago.
There you go, yeah. Yeah, excuse my poor pronunciation on that one. You mentioned balance organs and things like that. We're going to kind of dive into what kind of happens when the system fails or what can go wrong. Before we do that, just for kind of people that don't have maybe the broader kind of understanding of it, what are our balance organs? And
Sure. Yeah. So our balance organs, as I mentioned, are deep within the ear. As I said, 3 semicircular canals, a utricle, and a saccule. And what's remarkable about all 5 organs, and that's just in one ear, you've got the same set in the other inner ear, is that they're all sort of oriented precisely. In other words, if we look at the 3 semicircular canals, they're all right angles to each other. So what does that mean? Well, it means that absolutely any head movement will be detected. In other words, that rotation that you make with your head, one of those or more of those canals will detect that motion, right? So it's a remarkable piece of biological engineering. It's just, it always blows me away when I see these 3 sort of planes that are represented by these semicircular canals. And that's how modern inertial organs, sort of instruments work, right? And then the 2 other things are the utricle and saccule. The utricle is really good at sort of backwards and forwards motion, side to side, that sort of stuff. So in what we call linear motion, right? Backwards, forwards, side to side. And then the saccule is really good at up and down motion. So it's actually very good at detecting gravity. So it's a gravity receptor. So with the 3 semicircular canals, the utricle and saccule, they've got you covered. Any possible movement you can make will be detected by one or more of these organs.
And so do they work to balance each other out? Like I think we spoke before we did the podcast and we kind of used the analogy of a camera stabilizer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what's great about watching this new technology come on board. I don't know if you've ever had one of those handheld sort of iPhone holders that actually adjust every time you move your hand. It sort of moves.
Gimbals.
Yeah,
So,
that's
yeah, yeah.
exactly. And also, I think I was just watching the not State of the Union.
Is that origin?
State. Yeah, that's right, exactly. State of Origin football, and there was a lot of cameras that were handheld, but they were steady cams, right? In other words, the guy could be running along, or probably on one of those segways or something like that, and they could keep a smooth and how should I say, not a handheld feel to it, right? And that's exactly what we do with our own eyes, is with the help of the balance system. Every time we're walking, normally you would think, and if you held just a camera in space as you were walking, you'd actually realize it goes up and down. That's what we do. But you never detect that. And the reason is, your eyes are making these little adjustments up and down as you walk. So everything's smooth, just like that steady cam. And that's why while you're jogging or while you're walking, you can read signs. Someone who has that balance system issue has to stop walking, and then they can read, because everything's blurred, just as it would be with a handheld camera. Sorry, I digress.
No.
I'm so excited about this subject. Anybody wants to talk to me about it, I just can't believe it. So, so I sort of digress. But what I'd say is that the balance system itself is then just passing those signals on to the brain, and it's a direct connection straight into, again, what we'd call almost primitive parts of the brain that were there long established, long before we had areas that were established for vision, and certainly long before we had areas established for hearing. Hearing is actually a very recent acquisition.
There you go. You've done a bit of work with geriatric patients on Meniere's disease?
We've done some work, yes, absolutely. And we're sort of looking to see, Meniere's, I might add, is a debilitating disease of balance, but it's also of hearing too. And quite often, it's the hearing that takes most of the sort of spotlight when people are thinking about Meniere's, because they hear ringing in their ears, they hear sort of roaring sounds, but it's the balance or loss of balance that is the key to Meniere's, I think. And it really makes the people who've got Meniere's reluctant to leave the house at times, because they're not sure when it's going to happen. There's this attack. They sometimes feel it coming on, and therefore they can take appropriate action. But it's certainly a disease, we think, of the inner ear, and in particular the balance organs. And the work that we did was actually look at. We got the generous approval of patients to. Sometimes it's so intractable that surgeons actually have to remove their inner ear on one side, so that they're then really just relying on the good side, because it usually does affect one side rather than both sides. And what we were able to do with the help of cooperative patients, friendly cooperative patients, and a surgeon, is to remove that tissue from the inner ear, because it's no use to them. In fact, it's contributing to their loss of balance, because it's giving the brain wrong signals, and the brain doesn't know what to do with two different signals. It gets confused, and so it throws up its hands and says, I don't want to know about this. I'm just going to make you feel ill so you don't move your head, right? And so we take that tissue, we took it back into the lab, and we did two things with it. We were able to keep that tissue alive long enough to record electrical activity from those hair cells we talked about earlier. And what we found was actually those hair cells were normal. What was left, now there weren't many of them, which means that, at least to us, is that Meniere's it certainly affects the balance organs, but it doesn't kill the activity or alter the activity of the fundamental units in there, those hair cells. What it does kill them because of increased pressure, as it turns out. But if we could, say, reduce the pressure, find out a way to encourage those hair cells to either regrow or get the nerves to grow to them, then we've got a potential cure for many years. But I certainly don't want to raise any hopes, because that's obviously a long way away.
I know for a lot of people kind of having balance issues, and even when you're kind of entering like a panic state, you will lose kind of your sense of balance and your orientation. And what's the kind of correlation between patients that you've sat with and their experience with anxiety? Is it related to their balance, do you think?
Yeah, it is. And again, the more we know about balance systems, the more remarkable it is. In other words, there are studies to show now that the information of balance doesn't go to a special part of the brain, right? In other words, if we think about vision, it finds its way to the back of the brain, what we call the occipital lobe, and there's basically we have a visual cortex there. And same with hearing. There has special areas on the brain which we call sort of primary sensory areas. The balance system doesn't have a special area. In fact, I would argue it has all the brain. It distributes itself to places like the hippocampus, which is known to deal with spatial orienting, in other words, and it's often affected badly by Alzheimer's. So quite often, dizziness in Alzheimer's patients is as a result of the connections between the balance system and the hippocampus being reduced or being sort of altered. And the same thing happens in Parkinson's. It turns out that there's connections between the balance system and the striatum, which is an area deep in the brain that has to do with coordinating our movements. So as I'm throwing my hands around here, I'm using part of that, the basal ganglia and the striatum, to sort of coordinate smooth movements. And it's precisely that balance information that's required to help us with that smooth information, or smooth translation into smooth movements. And if you destroy or alter that balance system, then you get difficulty sort of making movements, being aware of where you are spatially, and also now sort of reducing those movements as it happens in Parkinson's.
Yeah, I think you could see why it would be so debilitating. I think that's one of the things that kind of stands out to me about it is, you said earlier on, like we don't really look at it until something goes wrong with the system. And I think, yeah, it's one of those ones that's so central to everyday life, and we don't think about it because we take it for granted or whatever reason. And then when it goes wrong, it's like you said before, people aren't even leaving their homes.
Yeah, you're right, and that's where when I go to work every day, I guess that's what I think about, is that there are people, and I live in Newcastle, and there's a great Meniere's support group there. And if anybody sort of lives in that area, then I'd highly recommend them joining if they have that kind of problem. It's people with Meniere's and people interested in Meniere's that get together. But it's very compelling, and it sort of, for me as a researcher, it sort of grounds me in, this is where this research is hoping to go. In other words, help people who at the moment have no recourse, no drugs, no real operations can help.
Yeah, talk to me about sedatives, and I think there's been a bit of kind of controversy in treatment with sedatives and things like that.
Yeah, that's mostly to do with treatment of dizziness. I mean, we're in the dark ages when it comes to treating balance disorders. And what I mean by that is that the common treatments for, say, motion sickness or even balance disorders is to give someone a sedative. In other
Mm.
words, take 2 pills and call me in the morning kind of
Mm.
thing. And usually they're things like antihistamines or I'm just trying to think of there's scopolamine, which is anti muscarinic. That's an important blocking agent in the nervous system. So there's scopolamine, there's promethazine. These are typical, and we've used them for 50 to 100 years or more, just to suppress the nausea, the anxiety, as you mentioned, and it's really, that's the way it works. It doesn't actually attempt to cure the dizziness or the imbalance that we have. And so, as I said, it's treating the symptoms not too well, because then it means that if you have to take a lot of it, you can't drive, you can't do important sensitive things if you're sort of sedated.
Yeah, well, we're not fixing the core issue, right?
No, you're just sort of papering it over and say, well, you'll get over it. And of course, most people do get over motion sickness once they get out in that environment. But if, for instance, they're on a ship, a submariner, in a submarine, it's say on a ship, I'm thinking on the surface where you've got sort of fairly violent movements. The crew has to be there for security as well as service, right? And safety. And so it's much like space sickness. You don't want them out of commission on rough seas, but a lot of them are. And so that introduces a level of safety that needs to be addressed.
So we kind of mentioned before the part that you study in the inner ear is so hard to get to. And you did a study with mice.
I did, yeah.
Did you develop the semi-intact model?
We did, yeah. So what that means is that we were able to keep some of the tissue alive, because, as I said, it's deep within the skull. We can't possibly do this on humans. And this is where I'd say, some people obviously find this, there are sensitive issues, but let me say from the get-go is that there are very strict rules about any kind of animal research. There has to be no pain. The animal can't suffer. And indeed, the experiments that we do, we just take the inner ears out. We've already euthanized the animals or the mice. And we're able to keep this tissue alive, and we can record electrical activity, because unfortunately no modeling, no amount of guessing is going to actually tell us how these things actually work. So we're able to look, in fact, eavesdrop on the communication between those sensitive hair cells that detect motion and the nerve fibers going back to the brain. So we can now figure out the code that's used by these sort of specialized hair cells, and they then get passed to the nerve. Because in the end, ultimately, we'd love a balance aid like we have a hearing aid to help people who do have balance issues. But we've got to know how it works before we can bring in sort of ways to treat things, or even bring in prostheses or aids to help us balance. And so while no scientist I know goes to work, thinking that they really want to work on animals, it really is a case where there's no other way to find out how these things work. So in the most humane way, we do work with animals, virtually all mice, and it's been a breakthrough in understanding how the system works.
Yeah, I want to dive into the kind of process of that a bit more. But I agree with the ways of studying kind of biology and even just anatomy scans and things like that just don't work with this part of the ear.
Unfortunately, yeah. We only get so much information, and anatomical information is absolutely valuable. The way things are structured, that's great. And that often can lead you to better understand function. But the
Mm.
only way you're going to understand function is when it's working,
Yeah.
right? And that's sort of what we're doing right now, is looking at the way this works in awake, freely moving mice, and it's I think it's been a revolution.
What have you found that's kind of steering the research here and where we're kind of going to with?
With that kind of research, I think what we're able to do, and this is technology that's only come about in the last 5, maybe 10 years at the most, where we can eavesdrop with special mini microscopes. They're tiny, tiny little microscopes where we can look at the brain in real time as the animal's moving around. They're unperturbed by having this sort of mini scope on top of their heads. And we're looking at neurons that have been specially labeled with these fluorescent dyes that show us when they're active. So for the first time, we're able to see the brain in action. I mean, I can't tell you sort of what a step change in our understanding this has occurred. And I'm not just talking about the vestibular system. This is, it started in looking at the brain itself, the cortex. All we've done is sort of modified it so we can look at the neurons that we're interested in within the brainstem. And for the first time, we can see when they're active. And that's always been, a mystery. When does this, and as I said, the feedback information, when does it happen? And what we've discovered, I think, is that this information in this feedback system occurs before head movements, which is just blows my mind.
Yeah, explain that before head movement.
So what we are picking up from these, and that's all we're doing, we're just watching these cells, and we do have these accelerometers, just like you have in your iPhone, within the camera itself, so we can actually tell when the head's moving, and we can sort of synchronize when do we see the lights flashing from these neurons and when the head is moving. And what we can see is that it flashes maybe 30 to 80 milliseconds. Now that's 30th or 80th of a thousandth of a second, which sounds incredibly fast, but in actually neuron terms, it's fast, but it's not that fast. If we think about a synapse, which is a communication between one neuron and another, that happens within 1 to 2 milliseconds, right? So a 30-second delay means that it could have gone through quite a few neurons before it gets to the neuron that's flashing, but that flash is occurring just before the animal moves its head. So what we think is happening is that just before there's a signal from the brain to the muscles, neck muscles, to move the head, that signal is already going to this neuron, and then that's sending information to the balance organs to warn it, saying, hey, you're about to make a big head movement. Don't worry about it. It's you that's making it. It's not the world that's changing. It's you that's making the head movement. We'll take that out of the picture, and then if you sense anything else, then that's important. Attend to that, right? So
that's how we're deciphering between kind of what's important and what's not. And
exactly, yeah, it's the difference between active head movements, which are movements that we make, and passive movements are the things that happen when we're not expecting them, right? In other words, you're in a car, you're bobbing up and down, and then you come to a sudden stop. You're not expecting that. So that's a passive motion. Some other force is moving your head. Whereas an active motion is something, I want to turn my head towards the camera or towards the curtain. That's an active head movement. I know I'm going to do it. So I might as well warn my balance system that that's what's coming up.
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to mind with me here is I spent a fair bit of time in kind of boxing and competing in that sport. And we have like ever-evolving concussion protocols now. And when we're kind of taking, say, an external force or external trauma to the head, we lose our balance in that moment. Do we know much about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's been a big force that even though, say, if you're in a fight or in a contest, you're sort of ready for that blow in case it gets past your defense. But you never know quite when it's going to happen. Not like a head movement that you're going to generate, because you know exactly when it's going to happen.
Is this what we call passive?
Yeah, so that the hit would be a passive head motion. But if we're trying to avoid the movement by ducking and weaving, then we're making those movements, right? And therefore, we're sort of taking that out of the equation, and we're sort of priming the system to say, well, anything else that you feel or sense in terms of that's been imposed on you, right? So so passive is sort of, it's not a great word, but it means motion that's imposed on you. And that's what happens sort of, say, when you're in, sort of martial arts or boxing. You're having to make adjustments, your own adjustments, but you also potentially, if you're getting struck in the head, you're receiving these things. Now, what I'd say, that momentary imbalance is to do with the force, sure. You're making compensatory arrangements because you have these reflexes that are able to keep you balanced so that you don't completely fall over just because you've had a knock to the head. Although that can happen, of course. You can momentarily lose your consciousness. You can also, get slightly disoriented by that force. But you quickly recover, and you're for your own survival, actually. The quicker you recover, the better it is. So we have mechanisms to do that. But what that blow, a very hard blow, can do is disrupt the inner ear. So sometimes car accidents or trauma, or even a physical contact in sports, that, like concussion, that can sort of alter the balance system or damage it because of the forces involved. It's as I mentioned, it's an extremely exquisitely sensitive set of organs. So you can imagine that a big hit is going to potentially cause some damage. Yeah.
So it's a system that we can train.
Yeah.
Some people are better than others. And we kind of talked about how exposure to more of the disorientating environments, you'll adjust over time.
Sure.
How can we kind of train it? And is it important to train it when we get older for fall prevention and things like that?
So that's a great question, because I was talking to a rehab physio, and she was saying that her best patient, because she goes to a lot of aged care facilities, and she says by far and away the people who are best adapted, that get around, are people who actually dancers, and also people who did a lot of, say, martial arts or I hesitate to say boxing, but sort of where you're moving constantly, and surfing is an example of where you're being constantly stimulated by the rock and rolling of the waves. So the longer you can keep surfing, because it really is a case of use it or lose it. And sitting in front of the TV for days on end is the worst thing you can do for your balance system. So what she was saying was that dancers are the best because they're used to a life of movement, right? And it's that constant movement, constant information going to your brain, and the brain loves it, and it'll latch onto it and keep, obviously keep things going. So I'd recommend to all of you listeners and viewers that keep moving, even if it's jumping up and down on a trampoline. Keep moving.
Yeah, we're certainly not recommending anyone take up boxing for their long-term health.
Possibly not. No, mainly because of the head injuries that you can sustain from it.
Yeah. Where are we going with this? What are you doing now? Where are your interests?
Well, it's all a matter of funding, as always. It's a case of you can only do as much with whatever money you can have. So, unfortunately, funding is getting tighter and tighter. And so we're just coming to the end of our funding cycle. So I've just submitted another grant to the federal government. But, how can I put it? Even though I think this is very important and very interesting, it's competing against all sorts of other things, including people trying to solve cancer. So it's you're in the mix with a lot of people. You try and make a good case for these things. It's true. Probably no one dies of vestibular malfunction, but I would argue, as a lot of people do, if your balance system doesn't work, especially as you get elderly, you have falls. And falls, I was surprised to learn this the other day, falls are the largest injury-related deaths in Australia. In other words, if you've got an injury-related accident, or basically falls are it, and the result of falls is often death or ultimately or other really significant health problems.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that's concerning especially as we're getting older and we're living longer. I think it's one of those things that we need to keep actively pursuing to make sure we're engaging with and being healthy and kind of preemptive with that.
Absolutely. I think, again, use it or lose it. And what we've found, unfortunately, is that feedback system is affected by aging. There's no doubt about it. It's what we call cholinergic. In other words, it uses acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, and they're notoriously affected by aging. All the acetylcholine systems in our nervous system get reduced, and this is one of them. And so what I would suggest, at least our data suggests, is that if you are sort of getting on in years, I would suggest don't move your head too quickly. If you're up on a ladder, it's your classic sort of male over 50 falling off ladders, and I would argue that it might be to do with quick changes in head movement, where you momentarily lose your balance and then you fall off the ladder, right? So if you can keep your head movement smooth as you get older, that's going to help you enormously. And if you can take up dancing as well,
That's a good note. For people that are kind of wanting to hear more about the vestibular system and learn more about it, where can they go? And where can we go to find more of your research?
Oh, gosh. Well, I sort of looked up Chat GTP or, was a Microsoft Copilot. And I've got to say, it's getting better all the time. In fact, I'm not so familiar with something called vestibular stimming. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's the way it's related to autism spectrum disorders, where people, for instance, they rock or they do big sort of movements. And it's self-soothing. In other words, these people we find it alarming, watching people, say, rocking to and fro or, doing big movements. But for the person that's doing it, it's almost like they want to stimulate their vestibular system because of perhaps this, what we call hyposensitivity. In other words, because there seems to be some sort of reduced information from the balance system into the brain. And what they want to do is sort of goose it up. They want to increase it. So in short, getting that information to the brain is key and it's critical. And I think more and more information is suggesting that if you're losing it, you need to sort of try and force it in somehow. And if it means doing more head movements, if it means more jogging even, then do something where you're actively moving your head so that you can retain or at least maintain what you've got.
Yeah, I think in autism, we kind of talk about the hyper and hypos, over and under.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
We have too much of something or not enough of something.
Correct.
And that was a point that we kind of made when we were speaking before, we kind of have this overstimulation of certain kind of senses. And you made a great point, I think, when we were talking about how we can introduce other sensory inputs to kind of regulate that out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can
Yeah.
you speak more on that?
Yeah. Well, often they mention, especially people with ADHD, a sort of, giving them a very vigorous body rub. It sort of helps focus their attention, not from all this information that's coming to the brain, but back to something significant that's happening to their body. And that seems to reduce the levels of information and potentially anxiety, because when you're getting bombarded with all this information, your brain sometimes says, hey, this is too much. In other words, yes, I love information. I'll suck in as much information as I can. But if you're overwhelming the channels, give me something to focus on. And quite often say vigorous stimulation or rubbing of the legs or the arms or the shoulders. And I would say of the head as well. That will begin to sort of focus the person's attention on the things that are important. In other words, that sensory information coming in. And then automatically that overwhelming information from other senses is then sort of reduced or dampened. And that's an important way of regulating times, because it's not happening all the time, but at times when that information is overwhelming.
Yeah, it's like the overactive neurons.
Yeah. And rather than taking a sedative, as we were saying, use the system itself and sort of decrease the amount of information, or at least focus it on something, and then that way it'll tend to sort of diminish the external information that's coming in.
What's 2 or 3 points that we can kind of leave our listeners with on the vestibular system to think about?
Oh boy. Well, again, I would say that think about just think about it. That's number one. Think that you do have a balance system. In other words, there was a time, I think we mentioned just off camera, about alcohol. And what's interesting about alcohol is that fluid that I mentioned inside the inner ear has a certain, what we call specific gravity or density, right? And what happens is when we drink, that alcohol goes everywhere, but it also finds its way into this fluid, and it makes it just a little bit less dense, because alcohol is less dense than the fluid in our ears. And so what that means that the hair bundles now are not being pushed as much as they should be, right? So it's disorienting. It makes us dizzy, right? And so we go to bed dizzy, right? But you can sort of overcome it. It sort of might go away while you're still drunk, and that's fine. You go to bed, and what happens is, as you're sleeping, that alcohol evaporates, and that fluid goes back to normal. But your system, as I mentioned, tends to go to sleep a little bit as well. And because you're not stimulating it very much because you're sleeping, when you get up in the morning and start stimulating the vestibular, it still thinks it should be that lighter fluid because the alcohol, it's gone, right? And so quite often people feel dizzy in the morning as well. Yeah. So you've got the nighttime dizziness, and then you've got the after effect, which is dizziness in the morning.
I always thought it was related to hydration. I would wake up or I'd drink. I don't drink anymore, but I would drink a lot of water before I went to bed, but I would still wake up feeling dizzy, and I never could crack it. And now I know.
You're right, for other reasons to drink water, because you do dehydrate the rest of your body. But in this specific instance, as far as balance is concerned, it has to do with that inner ear fluid being changed by the alcohol initially, and then changed again when it evaporates.
Okay. Oh.
Anyway, sorry. Again, I get excited and digress, but you mentioned three things. One is just think about our vestibular system and keep it exercised, right? Even if it means sort of moving your head from side to side, that's information. The other thing I would say is that unfortunately, as we get older, it's going to get it's going to respond less well.
Mm.
And so we've got to be aware that we can't quite do the same things that we used to do when we were teenagers, which is probably when we're at our peak. And the last thing I'd say is that it's never too late. In other words, even if you've got balance problems, exercising it, doing things that stimulate it is going to bring back maybe not full function, but it's going to retain and at least improve what you've got. So keep using it.
Love it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Eddie.
Cheers.
Bye.